previously you've spoken about the idea that Canadians will need to make sacrifices to pay for defense spending. Can you outline what sacrifices you're expecting Canadians to make?
Well, I think right now we're in the...
This is why Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP and Canadians, Mark, have been demanding you to show a budget. Mark Carney announced a massive increase in defense spending today, stating that he would not only meet the 2% of our GDP, but he agreed to meet the 5% of GDP that the European Union was talking about, all while saying absolutely nothing about any cuts to anywhere else, and very little on what he would actually spend that money on. Let's take a look.
Hi, it's Steve Chase for the Globe and Mail. I want to ask you to what extent you have social license, to what extent you think you have public support for what defense experts are saying would be the largest increase in defense spending since the Second World War. We're talking 7% increases a year to reach that $50 billion number. It's going to crowd out other investments. It's going to crowd out requests for healthcare transfer increases. So to what extent do you think you have public support for this?
Well, thanks for the question, Steve. Let me answer this in two ways. The first is to provide some context to the overall 5% number. 1.5% of that 5% is what's called a defense industrial pledge. And as I described very briefly in my remarks, it's much more detail in the public documents, and we can go into more detail. In fact, the Minister of National Defense can go into an exhaustive detail here. But that the industrial element of that, much of this we are already doing. This is about building the resilience. What do we do to build the resilience of the country? How much are we spending on our ports, on our transportation infrastructure? How much are we spending in order to develop our critical minerals? What do we do to make sure we have a resilient telecommunications system? These are things that actually we, as government, both federal and provincial governments, these are responsibilities we have today to Canadians and responsibilities that, by and large, we are fulfilling. Now we're going to do a more proper accounting of that and a more strategic set of investments in that. So yes, we'll find gaps. We'll be transparent about that. We'll make up those gaps.
All right. What is Mark Carney saying here? Well, this is some smoke and mirrors and some shell games going on here, folks. All right. So he's saying we're going to spend 5%. 1.5% of that is this in industrial strategic investment, the way he calls it. And he then goes on to say that, you know, we're doing much of this already. So what he's essentially trying to do here, it's very shrewd, is he's trying to say, okay, we're already spending money on ports. We're already spending money on transportation. We're already spending money on telecommunications and all of this stuff. We, as in organizations, big companies, the big four telecommunications companies, and also it's the provinces that is also spending money on all this stuff. So he's saying we, as in a collective we, which is interesting because he's now trying to have the government kind of take the credit for these companies and the provinces spending money on this stuff already. As he says, we're already doing this already. In terms of that 1.5% spend to GDP. So it's hard to know how to feel about this because the issue is we on Northern Perspective have always talked about the fact that we need to do a lot more to support our military. Okay? We need to be giving them the best equipment that money can buy, considering the fact that they have signed up to potentially make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. It's not too much to ask. But this isn't what Mark Carney is doing. What Mark Carney is doing is saying, well, let's use some accounting tricks to account for 1.5% of that 5% of GDP. So That's almost, what, 33 to 40% of that. And he's trying to just use that to explain it away because, well, the country as a whole, provincial and capitalistic and federal, we are already spending money on all this stuff. So that's going to count to that 1.5%. So to me, sure, that saves Canada, I guess, money in the long run. It's going to be money that the taxpayer doesn't have to fork out. But how is that going to look to our allies when we're kind of moving these shells around and playing smoke and mirrors to try and justify this 5%? I don't know.
So the overall context of the net increase in defense spending is much less than the headline from 2 to 5. First point. Very important point. But we have to show that, and we have to be deliberate and strategic about it, and we will. The second thing is what happens in terms of I'll call it the 2 to the 3.5, that number. We absolutely need to establish the political and social, to use the social license, the public support for that. It needs to be, as I indicated in my remarks, including my remarks in that room. First and foremost, we are protecting Canadians. We are protecting Canadians against new threats. I wish we didn't have to, but we do have to, and it is our core responsibility as government. And those threats, we see them, the evolving threat environment, most clearly in the Arctic, but it's also through the Arctic into Canada. And so we're taking our greater responsibilities around that. We have to be clear about what we're doing in order to achieve it. Last point. We're focused on the outcome, the result, protecting Canadians. We're driven by that, not by, with all due respect, sitting in the NATO building, by NATO accountants. And that's part of what's relevant for this 2029 review. We're going to focus on those new threats. We're going to take more of it directly in our responsibility, because they are our responsibility. They're threats on our soil, in our marine areas. And where possible, we're going to work with our partners, but we're also going to assess how well we've done, first and foremost to Canadians, whom we serve, but also to our partners. There'll be a review and there'll be an adjustment at that point.
So you may be wondering, how much? How much are we spending? Well, Globe and Mail put out an article today. Here's a little snippet from that. For Canada, this will require spending an additional $50 billion a year, nearly doubling the existing defense budget to $110 billion by 2035. This year, Ottawa's defense-related spending is due to top $62 billion. Quote, the world is increasingly dangerous and divided. Canada must strengthen our defense to better protect our sovereignty, our interests, and our allies, end quote, Mr. Carney said. Quote, these investments won't just build our military capacity, they will build our industries and create good, high-paying jobs at home, end quote. So I do want to kind of call the Globe and Mail out on this, because it's not an additional $50 billion. Let me show you what the main estimates back in November of 2024, this is 6 months ago, what they showed that the Trudeau government was slated to spend on defense in the government fiscal year ending this past March. This is directly from the Government of Canada website, as you can see, and I want to direct your attention to the bold area in the spending reductions and lapsed funding section there. While national defense has frozen $810 million in professional services and travel expenditures this year, overall spending has increased, with the supplementary estimates would increase up to $34.6 billion for fiscal year 24-25. So last year, according to that, it looks like we've only spent $34.6 billion on defense. So for us to go from $34.6 billion on defense up to $110 billion, that's an increase of around $76 billion. Just saying. Again, I'm all for spending more in the military if it's spent the right way.
The follow-up question is more of a reflection on the trip and what you hope to accomplish overall here. You said the other day that Canada is the most European of the non-European countries. You came here to sign a security and defense partnership. Serious question. Is there any way, or have you given any thought to possibly trying to chart a path to joining the European Union? Obviously, it's a geographical series of countries, but they also share a philosophy about how to arrange society and how to treat individuals, and they share a lot of values with us. So, is that door completely closed to us, or is there anything like being an observer or something that we can get to? Because I have to say that question comes up a lot in talking to Canadians these days.
Interesting. I haven't heard it expressed to me by Canadians, or many Canadians. So the short answer is no.
That's all I want anyone to hear, because that's the only relevant part of this answer. Now, Stephen Chase is framing this as in Canadians everywhere are asking to join the European Union. No, Canadians everywhere are not asking to join the European Union. Mark Carney is even saying, I haven't really heard from many Canadians asking that. And I believe him. So I like this is the legacy media now completely framing this to almost achieve an objective, which is, by the sounds of it, not, do you have any plans to join the European Union? No. Okay, next question. Instead of saying, well, a lot of Canadians are asking this question. No, we're not. The only Canadians that I know of that are asking about the European Union are people that are asking, Mark Carney is very cozy up to the European Union and the countries in it. Is he talking about joining us with the EU? And then let me add the last part to this. I hope not. That's the only context of Canadians that are asking, are we going to join the European Union? There's no desire to join the European Union. It doesn't make sense to join the European Union. We're halfway across the world. So I'm glad Mark Carney actually came out with this, and you could see in his facial expressions that he thought this was a ridiculous question. I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see that impulse, because that makes me believe that he has no plans to actually do this, and he confirmed that in his answer. That's one answer that he gave that I will believe.
Hi, Mr. Carney. Mackenzie Gray with Global News. Previously, you've spoken about the idea that Canadians will need to make sacrifices to pay for defense spending. Can you outline what sacrifices you're expecting Canadians to make?
Well, I think right now the people who've been making sacrifices have been the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, because they have not been paid to reflect what we are asking them to do. They haven't been operating with the right equipment in many cases. Many cases, their equipment hasn't been working. So the first sacrifices have been there, and we're making up for that and level setting that. And that's an important part of just what we're doing this year in terms of the increase in defense. The second thing I'd say is that the way we're looking at this, and you'll hear more about this in the coming months, that the investments we're making in defense and security, broader security, given the new threats that Canada faces, I think those, we're not at a trade-off. We're not at sacrifices in order to do those. These will be net additive. In other words, more of this will happen in Canada. More of it will help build our economy at the same time as it improves our defense, and we'll get the benefits. The question is, as we move towards later in this decade, and depending on how the threat environment evolves globally, if we are moving to the higher and higher levels of defense spending because that's necessary, then we will have to make considerations about what less the federal government can do in certain cases and how we're going to pay for it. Those trade-offs, I'm going to give you false precision around this, but those trade-offs happen towards the end of the decade into the next decade, and we will be much, much better informed. And if I can go back to Steve Chase's question, the social license element of that, there's going to be a very clear and open conversation about that based on facts and based on what Canadians want.
Mark Carney is trying to say that we're going to be spending over $60 billion on defense this year, which is a significant increase than last year. But Canadians aren't going to have to trade anything off. Mark, This is why Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP and Canadians, Mark, have been demanding you to show a budget. Because remember, budgets don't only show where you are spending money, but it also shows how you're going to pay for it. And it's also going to show what the difference is between your revenue coming in and your money expenditures going out. That's the deficit. So what is that number, Mark? What is it? Even the parliamentary budget officers, like, I can't say with any precision what it's going to be. Haven't seen the budget. So we're announcing all these massive increases in spending. How are we going to pay for it? That's the magical question. You're like a little kid in a candy shop and you're going hog wild, worse than Justin Trudeau. How are you going to pay for it? Like, this is the thing. You can say all these nice things like, oh, we're going to spend all this money on the military. That sounds great to Canadians. But if we don't have the money, how are you going to pay for it? You're only going to pay for it in two different ways. You increase your revenue, which is you're going to be taxing Canadians at some point, or you're going to be borrowing more money, which means the interest and debt servicing costs go up significantly, which means, oh yeah, right, Canadians are going to pay for it. Either now, or our children, or our grandchildren, or even further. So, yeah, Canadians are going to be sacrificing. It's just when. Now, one thing I want to go back to is that during this press conference, Mark Carney did make a speech at the beginning, as they usually do. And there's one thing I want to really, really zero in on. And it was some remarks around him talking about made in Canada. And that's something we need to talk about.
Canada does have enormous industrial capacity, but that will grow significantly. As our allies seek to increase their military readiness, they will buy more equipment and technology made in Canada by Canadian workers in shipyards, in labs, and shop floors right across our country. We'll make the drones, the icebreakers, the aerospace technologies, and much more that's needed to build a more secure world.
We'll make the drones? Really? We'll make other technology that we don't currently do today? There's not a company in Canada that I have looked into that makes drones. So who's going to make that, Mark? Now, part of this position that he's talking about is to have, it seems, Canadian companies, or at least Canadian companies that may not exist yet, but Canadian companies partnering with European countries in order to build weapon systems in Canada. Now that sounds nice on the surface, right? Because they're building in Canada, that means Canadian companies would be getting revenue, and that means Canadians would be getting jobs, right? Fine. But there's something we need to talk about here. And that is, how do we get to Canadian companies today not making this stuff to Canadian companies making this stuff? How do we get there? Well, the way to get there, if I'm interpreting what Mark is saying correctly and in his announcements, is that this defense spending, because remember, this is a lot of money, and he's only talked about F-35s, he's talked about icebreakers, and he's talked about submarines, and he's talking about paid the military a bit more. That's all he's talked about. What's the rest of this money going to? Well, sounds like what this is going to do is you are essentially going to be financing the building of this industrial complex for these Canadian companies that are partnering with these companies overseas, which means they're going to be getting a cut of this. in order to actually get to the point where these Canadian companies will become capable of actually manufacturing this equipment that allegedly everybody is going to come and buy from us. So this sounds like more smoke and mirrors, and this also begs the question, what are Brookfield's investments in these companies? And where are your investments as it relates to these investments in Brookfield that relates to these companies, Mr. Carney? We still don't know what your assets are. We still don't know where your investments are. We still don't know what your portfolio looks like, but you do. And it seems like you're in a real hurry to sign all of these agreements before we know what these assets are. So is it possible that Brookfield has their hands in these European companies and the Canadian companies that are going to be involved in this partnership? It's possible. Is it possible that Mark Carney and his portfolio are directly tied to these? It's possible. And is it possible that Mark Carney is going to make himself enormously wealthy because of the foreign and domestic policy that he is pushing Canada down in terms of its investment strategy? It's certainly possible. So remember, when it comes to NATO spending, unfortunately, that doesn't have to translate into physical equipment given to our troops. That can count towards, well, we put $50 billion into this industrial complex that is intended to manufacture equipment. That counts. So the thing that concerns me most, and the thing that should concern Canadians and our military most, is it sounds like we're going to be spending tens of billions of dollars over the next 10 years. Over $100 billion over the next 10 years if it's up to Mark Carney. And that money may not make it to our troops at all. Where it may make it to is some CEO's pocketbook, or Brookfield's balance sheet, or some company over in Europe that has nothing to do with Canada. This is where these questions must be asked. This is why we must have a budget. This is why we must know your assets. These are serious questions, and Canadians deserve the answers. Not tomorrow, not next month, not next year, today.